I'm actually very grateful because what it's done is it's allowed women to start to communicate with one another in a different way. Mm-hmm. It's forced them to help each other in a way that they didn't before. And I think they're very enthusiastic and excited about the opportunities.
Yeah.
Which I think for me makes me so thrilled. Because as I come, kind of full circle in my career, it's really neat to be able to see women younger than me and older than me who are getting to take advantage of all this information.
It is incredible.
It's fantastic.
Like you can feel it, you can see it. It's super exciting.
I'm so enthusiastic about it and thrilled.
You're listening to The Other 50%, a herstory of Hollywood. I'm Julie Harris Walker. This is the podcast where I talk to successful women in entertainment and hear their stories. Our presenting sponsor is the end-to-end production solution, Green Slate. Whether it's start paperwork, time cards, purchase orders, or reports, everything is digital, everything is on the app, and you can work from wherever you are. You can do it on your phone, on your iPad, on your desktop. The future is actually here. And if you'd like to hear this pitch in person or see it for yourself, call me and I will come over. I'm working there as the Senior Vice President of West Coast Operations. My number is 310-789-2001, extension 323, or jhw@gslate.com. Now, back to my other job. For today's episode, I sat down with Leslie Belzberg. Leslie is a producer, most notably working with John Landis on all of your favorite things, such as Three Amigos, Beverly Hills Cop III, Coming to America, Trading Places, Thriller, Sliders, Dream On, Blues Brothers 2000, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids series, Crazy Heart, and the list goes on and on and on, before she transitioned to being a production executive in-house. At the time of this recording, she was at Gaumont, but has since transitioned to the head of production for Imagine Entertainment. She has always worked toward diversity, even and especially when she was the only woman in the room. She has incredible perspective and experience, and it was such an honor to get to have this conversation. You can find us at theother50%.com for added features, photos, show notes, and the merchandise. I have very cool coffee cups and tumblers. You can also listen on Apple Podcasts and all the podcast places. Also, the full season of Catch a Break, The Insider's Guide to Getting Into and Navigating Hollywood, is available on Apple Podcasts and all the podcast places, and on the website, catchabreakpodcast.com. Go check that one out too. And we have just wrapped recording for season 2. I'll keep you posted as to when it will launch. All right, here's my conversation with Leslie Belzberg. Have a listen. What do you do?
I, at the present time, am an executive in charge of overall production for a production company known as Gaumont.
So are you doing Narcos?
I am doing Narcos. I'm doing an animated series for Netflix called F is for Family. We are involved in a documentary called Trial 4 with a French company. And we just completed a movie that's about to be released on Netflix called Point Blank, amongst many other things that I do.
Yes.
But at the moment, those are the things that are moving forward.
Now, let's go back and talk about your career, because I know you've had a beautiful and delicious, juicy career. And we were just figuring out before we started that our paths had crossed in the 90s at Disney. You're doing Honey, I Shrunk the Kids series.
Yes.
How did you get into this business in the first place?
It's kind of a long story, so to shorten it.
We got time.
Okay. I was an English major with a focus on contemporary drama when I was in my undergraduate years in Canada. And I was obsessed with repertory movies in theaters that were from, the all over the world international repertory. And I loved movies and always have.
Now, what do you mean when you say repertory movies?
I mean all the foreign films. There were many repertory houses in Canada. I would go to university in Toronto. And in the city, they had this great theater that ran all kinds of old movies. One might call the Criterion Collection today, but also tons of foreign stuff. And Zeffirelli, everybody you can imagine who was an international filmmaker was released and shown there. And so my education in film, not that I wasn't a huge moviegoer in contemporary movies, television wasn't as interesting in those days, particularly in Canada, but I loved movies. And so I was obsessed with watching them and enjoying them. And when I graduated from university, I decided I needed to go to graduate school. I wanted to be in New York City. So I did my graduate degree as a business major. I got my MBA long before women were doing that.
Yeah.
Because my interests between my undergraduate degree and my graduate degree, I worked as a political activist in Calgary for a women's organization called SWAC. That was the acronym, Status of Women Action Committee.
All right, you were ahead of your time.
So with that information, I realized that, and in Canada, it was the Canadian government was very generous with financial support for various nonprofit organizations. And you could apply for grants up to 3 years. And so SWAC had a grant for 3 years. And as those 3 years were coming to an end, I became part of that organization. And in its final year, and I realized that nobody really understood how to raise money and manage finances. They could figure out how to get the grant, but they didn't know how to sustain the financial aspects of it once it was completed. And so I thought, okay, here's an opportunity. I'm going to become a nonprofit fundraising consultant. At that time, while I was working for this organization, I met Phyllis Chesler, who had just written Women in Madness, and definitely long in the tooth when I think about it that way. And Phyllis offered me a job to do research for her in New York City. So of course I jumped at it. Yeah. Went to New York and worked on one of the several books she was working on at the time, and fell in love with the city. I'd never been to New York. I was in my very early 20s.
That's the perfect time to move to New York.
I had a blast. And also, when I got off the plane, even though I'd never been there, it was like, okay, this feels like home. Mm-hmm. So I embraced the city and realized, because I was Canadian, after my job with Phyllis ended, I didn't have a visa. So I had to either go to university or go home. Mm-hmm. And it was much more complicated to get a visa at that time just to hang out in New York City. So I decided to go to grad school, and I did my MBA. And I chose Fordham University over all the other universities that I'd been offered an opportunity at, because it was close to Avery Fisher Hall and Lincoln Center, because I knew I'd never use my MBA like anybody else. I didn't plan to go to Salomon Brothers or be a financier on Wall Street. I knew that using the information that I acquired would help me in some way, but I had no idea at that point in time what. While I was finishing my degree, I was offered an opportunity at the then Simon Wiesenthal Center, which was a nonprofit in Los Angeles, now the Museum of Tolerance. And I was very resistant to come out to Los Angeles, because the times I'd been here, I thought, okay, this is not for me. Mm-hmm. And
as a New Yorker, you're supposed to hate LA.
Right. I mean, I'm sort of I was really kind of one of those weird Canadians who came to New York and felt like I was a New Yorker. But I thought, okay, I could do this for a few years. So I went out, and while I was at the institution, they made a multimedia called Genocide. And Genocide was a 16 millimeter, 4 film projectors, 25 slide projectors. It was shot anamorphically, so all the information was collected by a very well-known graphic designer named Arnold Schwartzman, who worked for Saul Bass. And the narration was done by Elizabeth Taylor and Orson Welles. The music was done by Elmer Bernstein. So I was very, very fortunate to be exposed to all of them at that time.
Oh my God.
And because everyone was really keen to be part of this project. And while we were making it, the dean of the institution, whose name is Rabbi Marvin Heyer, came to me and he said, okay, well, what are we going to do with this once it's done? And I'm like, all right, I got to figure this out, because it would mean four-walling a theater all over the country and making it like a rock show. You know, you'd have to put it in a truck and travel it. And because it was a nonprofit institution, it seemed almost impossible to do that way. While I was doing the research on that, Faye Kanan, who was then the president of the Academy, came and saw the multimedia and said, you need to make this into a movie and enter it in the Academy Awards. So the Rabbi Heyer came to me and the programmers and said, okay, we need to do this. How are we going to do it? And so the guys I was working with basically said to me, okay, you can be a PA, an assistant editor, you can do all these different things. So I basically rolled up my sleeves with them, and in 3 months, we took this entire piece, tore it to pieces, and rebuilt it a lot of it in visual effects, because it was shot anamorphically. You couldn't just shoot it off a wall. And so we had to tear it apart and rebuild it. And we reshot it as a 35 millimeter movie. The institution, of course, was an Orthodox institution. So on Friday night and all day Saturday, we couldn't work. So we created another office for ourselves at Cinema Research, which you may remember. At that time, Peter Donnan was running it, and Peter helped us tremendously to figure out how to do this and shoot it. So we shot the thing, we worked our asses off, and we, in 3 months, because that's all we had because he wanted to enter it as an Oscar possibility in December, we entered it in the Academy Awards and it won an Oscar. So the way I describe my life is, oh, how the mighty will fall. It's interesting because what it did was, even though I was everything from a schlepper to an assistant editor, in those days we were cutting film on chems, and it was super fun, super exhausting, and fabulous. I loved every second of it.
And what an incredible experience.
Oh my God.
And your first experience.
Unbelievable.
With the Oscar.
Like, it's just
amazing.
Crazy. So.
And thus a film producer was born.
And that's a film. Yeah. More like I was keen to get into the movie business and I knew, okay, this was my calling.
Yeah,
and I guess I touched on it when I was in undergrad anyway. So I went out and looked for a job. And left the institution, went out and looked for a job, and was very, very fortunate to meet George Folsey Jr., who was then John Landis's partner. George and John were about to go off and do Trading Places, which was then called Black or White. And George and I met, and we just loved each other. And George was like, I'm really sorry, but I've already hired someone to come with me to New York. They were shooting it in New York City. And he said, but if you come out, just come visit me. So I said, okay. So I got home that night, and on my answering machine was a message from him going, you know what? I changed my mind. You should come with me to New York. So I packed my bags. I had to get there on my own. I had to find a place to live, which I had very good friends in New York who were very generous and let me bunk on their couches.
You could work as a local.
I could work as a local, right? And I had my green card, so that was okay by then. And I got $80 a day, and away I went. And I worked like crazy, and I was mentored by a fellow who I owe a huge debt of gratitude, not only to George and John, but to him. His name was Sam Williams, who was the associate producer, what I would call a line producer, for George and John on American Werewolf in London. And he came with them to New York, and he basically trained me. And he had to leave halfway through the movie because his daughter was getting married in London, so they just slipped me into the job.
He just handed it over to you?
Basically, yes. I became a line producer on Trading Places. So, you know, I did tons of different stuff. I worked with George and John. I was basically George's assistant. But when a movie came along, I basically line produced their movies, and we did Thriller. Right after Trading Places, I think we did, can't remember the sequence anymore. It was either Thriller and then Into the Night, or Into
Thriller,
the Night.
The music video?
Yeah. So I worked as an accountant, production accountant, and a coordinator on that. And then I started basically line producing all their movies. And then by the time we got to Coming to America, I was producing, and I think I got an executive producer credit on that because it was a lot of Eddie's people and a lot of our people. And so I really was on the floor with John, and because we had such a short fuse on that movie, George, who comes out of the post-production world and is a brilliant editor, was in the cutting room most of the time, so I was on the floor all the time. So after the Coming to America, we wrapped it May 5th. And it was in the theaters June 29th. So it was an amazing feat of, you know, both George and John. So from then on, of course, we had a reputation for being able to make movies on a short fuse. But George left to go do something different. And so I just stayed with John, and we ended up being producing partners. At that time, we also had the beginnings of a TV company because we had an overall deal at Universal. And Sid Sheinberg and Lou Wasserman were then the heads of the company, and one day came to us and said, we've got all of this black and white film footage sitting in the vaults from all of the GE Presents and all those movies that were on, the series that were on TV. I never watched them because it was before my time, but also because I grew up in Canada. And so they said, figure out what to do with them. So we met a very young Marta Kaufman and David Crane, who then ended up doing Friends after our show. But we met with them and we created Dream On, which was a show that was made, a half-hour show that was made for HBO. And that sort of got us involved in the TV side as well. So from there we did, and as you've mentioned, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, we had an overall deal at Universal for a period of time, and then we ended up having a TV deal at Disney where, same thing, we said, just open your vaults to us and tell us what we can play with. And we created Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, the series, which had a good long run on the Disney Channel, and several other shows that we did. We did a show called Sliders. We did a bunch of long-form television, and then we made movies and TV. So I was across everything. So when we'd make at least a movie a year and be prepping another, and I oversaw the TV company. So I was very fortunate to have been able to get my opportunity to learn television at the same time I was making movies.
Yeah.
Which was, at that time, I didn't realize was kind of unique.
Yeah, no one was crossing over.
Nobody was crossing over. And also, it was such a different time. I think that we've touched a little bit on this, but I was probably one of 3 or 4 women producers at the time.
Yeah.
Dawn Steele, Deborah Hill, and Linda Obst. I think it was just us. I don't remember. Sherry Lansing was then later the head of the studio and had been producing with Stanley Jaffe. Mm-hmm. But other than that, there were very few women.
So you didn't have a women's production
society.
There
was no such animal. And in fact, I'm very grateful to the men in my life because they mentored me.
Sure.
And gave me the opportunity to be able to take a position in my job where I became influential in telling them, we have to have more diversity in our group. And John was very good about this. When we made Coming to America, we went to the guilds and said, we want to make this as diverse as possible a films. We want as many black folks and as many women as we can.
Behind the camera?
Yeah. We couldn't find anybody. There was nobody except in wardrobe, and there was a casting director. There was and hair and makeup. There were almost no people of color, Latino or black, female or male. And so we grandfathered in a number of people wherever we could, but we did a high and low search trying to find a camera operator and, somebody who could work in the art department. It was very challenging. And so I feel very grateful that I was working with John, who, both of us, whom were very, very sensitive to the issue of diversity. And so from there, it's kind of like, we just kept making movies and television. And then John could take a break, but I really couldn't economically at that point in time. So I went out and I got a job consulting for MTV through my good friend Laretha Jones. And Laretha was producing then too. That's the other person. And Laretha and I had a great friendship and we helped each other wherever we could. And Laretha was at Paramount. And so I made a bunch of long-form television for MTV. I had a deal with them to consult on their movies. At that time, we made a ton of stuff for TV. And we made a few movies that were for theatrical release, but most of it was for television. And so my career just sort of, I bumped around and consulted and did things. And then I adopted a child by myself, who's now 21. So it was very early in the years, thank you, for a female to adopt a child by herself. But I felt like I really wanted to do that. And so I realized, as supportive as John was, because my daughter Sophie was born while we were making Blues Brothers 2000 in Toronto, and he was super helpful because he loves kids. And I made that movie, and the best story of it all was that the birth mom had said that in September the baby would be born. So of course, in classic producerial fashion, I figured out, okay, I can make this movie. I can get home, I can be ready to prepare the house for my newborn, and it'll all work out fine. And then I learned somewhere between Toronto and Calgary, because we were making honey, and I was flying on the weekends to work on honey and shooting during the week in Toronto, that the birth mom had miscalculated and my daughter showed up in July. So, of course, I had a moment of panic, having never really been a parent. And fortunately for me, all the people that I was working with on Blues Brothers 2000 in Toronto were women everywhere. My production manager was a woman. The entire office were women. Everybody was a woman. And they all said to me, don't worry about it. We've got your back. We all have kids. We'll be sure you're okay. So what did you do? So in the middle of the strip scene in Blues Brothers 2000, I got a call saying, hey, the mother's in labor. You got to get on a plane and go back to LA. So I flew back to LA. I went right to the hospital. I picked up my daughter. My lawyer, who was also one of my dear, dear friends, was a family lawyer, and she arranged for me to go see the county court so that I could take Sophie back with me to Toronto. So within 3 days, Sophie was on a plane with me, and we were back in Toronto.
Did you get a passport that fast?
We couldn't get the passport, but I could apply for her passport after 90 days because she wasn't really mine, but we got dispensation and paperwork to take her out of the country.
Amazing.
So it was challenging because, of course, kidnapping children in those days wasn't quite as common, but it was
But you didn't have a birth certificate.
No, it was very challenging. Fortunately, I had all her paperwork. And again, as a producer, you're kind of well prepared for any possibility. And taking her across the Canadian border was a bit of a challenge. But once we got her there, it was fine. And so she basically grew up on a movie set.
So did you set up a nursery and have a nanny and just all day
in the office? And she came to me every day at lunch. And then I have her at evenings and on the weekends. And from the time she was 3 days old until now, really, she's been exposed to movies and television and happens to be a wonderful artist who I think will end up in animation. So I guess all of those movies we saw together paid off somewhere. But it was really interesting. And I'm so grateful to all those women because they never for one moment made me feel like I couldn't handle everything. And digressing for a minute, the reason I went in-house was because my daughter was a teenager and I couldn't travel with her because she traveled with me all over the world and all the movies I made. And at a certain point in time, it just became too challenging because she was in her teens and needed to be in high school and stay put. And
so time for the studio job.
That's right. And so I moved into Shine, where they were making a series called The Bridge, and they hired me as a consultant to oversee the pilot. And then if the show got picked up, they put me on staff, and that's what happened. And so from there, I was at Shine for 3 years. Then Shine and Endemol merged. So then I was at Endemol, and while I was at Endemol, they weren't terribly active in dramatic TV. They were doing mostly reality, which is really not my world. And Miramax came a-calling. So I moved over to Miramax and oversaw their television and movies.
Was this after the divorce or
yes,
before the
after
divorce?
the Weinsteins had divorced Miramax. And I built out an infrastructure there, which is something that I became quite good at because Shine needed it as well. And then Miramax got sold. So then when Bill Block, who was the new, I don't know whether he was considered the president of production or whatever, I don't know what his title was. He basically hosed the entire creative team. And so my staff was collateral damage because there was nothing for us to produce.
Right.
So I finally took some time off. I took about 3 months off, and then I got a call from Blumhouse Television, and I consulted for them for 6 months, and then Gaumont came along. And I've been there for almost 2 years, and it's been super fun. And what I've learned at Gaumont that I didn't really, even though I've done a lot of international production, it's different to oversee production in international environments where we went on Spies Like Us, we were in, Morocco and Norway and Britain, but you're there for a period of time, you set up the infrastructure and then you go home and you finish your movies there. So what Narcos did was it really informed me about working in another country. And while I was working on Narcos, our distribution side picked up a show called El Presidente that shot in Chile and Argentina. So my staff and I oversaw that. So I spent a lot of time this year in both Mexico and in Latin America. My Spanish is getting much better. And it's been a really interesting experience to understand the international marketplace, which I think, given what we're seeing in the streaming world, if you look at the new streamers, not so much the ones that haven't really launched yet, but for example, Amazon and Hulu and Netflix is doing probably 80% international and 20% domestic is what their mandate was, I learned this year. I don't know if that's a true fact or not. That's something I don't know whether it's true or not.
And they're doing
that's what I heard.
so much domestically.
Yeah. But if you think about what you watch on Netflix, you have the opportunity to watch tons of international television that didn't exist, either internationally, maybe when I first started working in this business. You could sell your television series and your movies of the week to an international marketplace as a movie on video because they didn't have anything to watch on television.
But they're making local programming internationally?
Local programming. And so El Presidente is made for Amazon Latin America, but also for the international marketplace and hopefully in the States. So it's been a very interesting experience for me because you need to look at the way they make television differently than you do here. And Americans have a very specific way of making TV. And it's been an incredible learning experience for me. And I'm very, very grateful for it because it's given me a very different perspective on how television can be made. Not necessarily because we'll make it that way ever in America, but because they make TV differently, they make it for a lot less money, and they make really good television.
Like, what are some of the differences?
First of all, the whole idea of Global Vista and an idea of entertainment partners and a payroll service and all of that is very different there. That's not to say they don't have an infrastructure.
But there's a lot of cash going on.
There's a lot of cash, but also the other thing is that they've never heard of an Amort and a pattern budget. They do a consolidated budget. They do it with a spreadsheet. They do it with an Excel program and, they do an amazing job, but they can't forecast. So what we came up against was the challenges of not imposing the ugly American way to do it, but rather to try and understand, okay, what would make the most prudent sense in these environments? In Mexico, we basically do it the American way. Right. But my understanding is when they first began Narcos in Colombia, they did it more like what we're doing in Chile until they could create an infrastructure where they could...
Rich go down and consult with them?
Everybody went down and everybody consulted with them, from what I understand. And also they brought in a new producer halfway through, I think, the second season. And that person, who was an American, brought in an accountant from the States, and she helped create with him a more structured financial infrastructure that now in Mexico, the first time I went into the offices in Mexico, I was like, oh my God, I'm in the IRS. There was so many accountants. It was crazy because you have to do fiscal responsibility. You have to report payroll differently. Yeah. You have all of the different issues that we don't necessarily have to deal with here. And so there's a staff of, half a dozen people just dealing with the accounting for Narcos, but also there's a whole group of people doing compliance. And because American money is crossing borders and so forth and so on. Yeah. So it's been a very, very interesting experience for me and fascinating. That show is run like an American show in the sense that the writers are based here. The accounting is done in a EPE payroll structure. El Presidente, on the other hand, is done sort of as a hybrid because what we realized is, okay, it's too complicated to have them learn this system. They have a really interesting accounting system in Chile called Unibase, which basically accounts for all their labor on a day-to-day basis because they pay monthly, they don't pay weekly. So that's the first difference. But also the way they shoot and the way their infrastructure works is very different than ours. And making a show for $500,000 is not unheard of there. Making a show for $1.5 million is like having hit the mother lode.
It's so much money.
It's so much money for them.
So do you have, if I could just nerd out for a moment, do you have like an American doing kind of cost reports and consolidating at the end to report to the Americans?
What we did was I chose two different ways of dealing with this. One was to try and find you need a Spanish-speaking accountant.
For sure.
Which was hugely challenging. Like anyone listening to this who has children who should be accountants, please make sure they're bilingual. At least in 2 languages, if not more, because of the nature of what we're doing in America today. But also, I was lucky enough through a good friend of mine, Ann Clements, who's a line producer, had worked a lot in Puerto Rico. So I reached out to her and I said, I need a Spanish-speaking production person that will be my eyes and ears in Chile, who has accounting experience. And I found this woman who's fantastic. We sent her down there, and she's been living there, and she has a small child that she took with her, which for me was like, okay, you can take your kid. It's no problem. Great. We've all done it. So then what we did was we figured out, okay, what do we need in the accounting world? And so we searched high and low for a Spanish-speaking accountant, and many people who will listen to this podcast will commiserate with me because endless requests on WPS about just this very thing. Mm-hmm. But we were able to find someone out of Mexico who brought her first down, and then we became much more hands-on on the show than we expected to be. But we had our financial guy in-house oversee the accounting system from a distance, but it's done on a weekly basis and cost reporting format that is slightly different than what we would expect in America, but it's working. So it's been a really interesting experience, and Gaumont is becoming much more the international company it always was, because it's based out of Paris. Mm-hmm. So they have offices in London, Cologne, and Paris, as well as here. And I think they will have a presence in Latin America very soon. So the company's broadening and expanding and looking at where the marketplace is turning. And I think that that's what's going to happen at Gaumont in the next short while.
Exciting.
Very exciting. And it's been a fantastic experience. I've really enjoyed learning this much about the international marketplace. And for me, at my age and my experience, I always think to myself, okay, what else is there to learn? And I think the reason that I've loved this business so much is because every day there's something new to learn.
There's always something.
And it's what's kept me going, but it's also what I love the most about it, because every day there's a new program to look at. There's a new visual effects component. There's things that we couldn't do years ago that are super simple now. Like when we did Coming to America, Albert Whitlock, who's a very well-known glass painter, and his 2 prodigies, Bill Taylor and Sid Dutton, John wanted to do a really cool thing where we would go into the country of Zamunda over the Paramount Mountain. So you'd follow it, your eye would follow over the mountain and into Zamunda. And in order to do that, we had to find this piece of land where we painted a portion of the base of the palace that you see. And then we had animals like giraffes and all these things crossing in front of it. And we had a glass painting done of the palace and the country behind. And it was fantastic.
Amazing.
Because that's how they did that then.
Right.
It was a matte painting that was painted, and I was just like, wow. And then when you see it transformed on film, you're just like, holy crow, that's amazing. So now that's all done in it's all done in visual effects in a computer. Yeah. And it's just incredible to see the work, just like 2D and 3D animation now that's done in computer and not hand painted. I still may be a bit of a long in the tooth in terms of my appreciation of 2D animation and how much I love it. And Gaumont has an animation component. And so I've been very fortunate to be able to participate in a lot of the animation they're doing as well. So it's been a really great run and exposed to all kinds of new stuff, because many of us who worked in live action, either television or movies, never touched animation, which is a completely different thing.
Yeah.
So it's been really interesting.
There's so many more questions I want to ask you. Because I'm going to ask you this so you can think about it for a minute, because I want to hear some tales from the trenches, because I know you must have some stories. But while you're thinking about that in the back of your brain, what do you make of what has happened with women over the last 3 years?
I'm thrilled. Yeah. I'm so thrilled. And what's so great about it is it gives me chills, because I realize how difficult it was for me in those days. And I'm so grateful. And many people listening to this will say that they had mostly male mentors, because there weren't any women, right. And the issue with the glass ceiling really did exist. I think women were really paranoid and afraid to share information and to help one another. Although that wasn't really my thing, because I didn't really care. I mean, for me, it was important for other women to be there so that I had support, moral support, if nothing else. And so I think this is incredible. And I think that it's just getting better and better. And when I see an organization like WPS, where every day there's a new person joining the organization, I just am so excited and thrilled by this. And Women Helping Women, it's fantastic. It's exactly what I would have wished for and hoped for when I was younger. And as we were saying earlier, it's one of those things where a lot of the generation after me had other women to share with, whether they had this kind of an organization or not. I did not have that. So for me, finding those few women that I met along the way and starting to trade information was the best thing that ever happened to me. I was so excited. Yeah. And then when I was asked to join WPS, that was even better. Because then I realized, okay, now it's happening with momentum. And this kind of momentum, seeing people in positions of power and in offices where they can actually make a difference is fantastic.
It's powerful. And we should say it's Women's Production Society.
Yeah.
Now, did you feel obstacles as you were coming up, or is it in retrospect you're like, well, that was harder than it needed to be?
Probably. I mean, honestly, I was really, really lucky, because we kept making movies and TV. And John, I remember, telling stories, it's one of these things. I remember John and I going into a meeting. I don't remember if it was for a TV series or for a movie. And the people in the room kept talking to him. And he finally turned to them and he said, why are you asking me these questions? Leslie has all the answers. She's producing it. I'm just showing up and directing it. And I think everyone was so taken aback. And I'm really like, that's who he was.
Yeah.
So
that's
I always felt that he advocated on my behalf, and also because I'm a gay woman. He was super, super supportive of the LGBTQ community, even in those days. Wow. And I think that, I never had, I think the reality is you sort of look at what do I have to manage first on a show? It's not going to be a problem for me to hire a crew, even though many of the producers and the crew were older than I was, because I made Coming to America when I was in my late 20s. So, the people that I accessed first were the Teamsters. I became friendly with the Teamsters, and that was golden.
So they had your back.
They totally had my back. And I preferred eating lunch with them. Half the time they had better food than anybody else on the show. But also, I just loved spending time with them, because I think, really for me, I really was a below-the-line person. I loved it. And of course, I had to rub elbows with all the actors and work with everybody above the line. But I loved rolling up my sleeves and getting into it, And problem solving is what we did all day. So if you had the right people to help you, and you had the support of those around you, you could do just about anything. And so the opportunities to bring more women in were simple for me, because wherever I could, because I had the support of the people around me. I think the hardest place was the Teamsters, because it was just a much more, it wasn't a closed society. I just think people didn't think about it. Women didn't choose to be a Teamster necessarily, a driver. And when that started to happen, that was fantastic. But when I would start a new show, whether it was TV or movies, I would make it a point to tell my producer showrunners or my producers, my line producers, UPMs, if that was the situation I was in, that it was a mandate of mine to have diversity and women on the show. And that was one of my mandates.
You were doing this before everyone decided we should do this.
I guess, yeah. And now it's just been easier.
Yeah.
Because
did you get any pushback?
a lot of people shrugged and looked at me and, rolled their eyes and said, where are we going to find those people? And I'm like, well, I'm going to help you. And also, I can give you a whole list. Mm-hmm. So go for it. And so we were really fortunate to be able to implement some of that. And now it's easy. I mean, it's still not easy for women, but it's easier for me to be able to mandate it and find people to put in those jobs. Yeah. Whereas before it was way more challenging.
We know they exist now.
Then it was really hard. I mean, finding a woman DP, impossible those days. But as many women in the camera department as I could find, whatever jobs they were doing, that was fine with me. Because I just knew that they were going to learn something that would help them move up the ladder. Mm-hmm. And once the men in the departments accepted it, that was the more challenging part, then it was easier. And so I had fun on my sets. That was the most important thing. Everyone had to be having a good time. If they weren't having fun, then why were we coming to work every day?
I mean, really, we're making movies.
And also, it's so hard. It's not glamorous making a movie or television. It's really hard work. So not having fun makes it even more painful. Yeah. And so for me, it was always very important to have a group of people around me and also around each other where they could, have fun, and they actually like to have lunch together. So I think I was really, really grateful there. When you were talking earlier, asking me about some of the adventures, when I was making Coming to America, it was a very challenging show. We probably had, and this is challenging me a little, but I think we had 7 stages at Paramount because we had to build the country of Zamunda. So we shot New York. We started in New York and we shot in New York, and then we came back and most everything else was done on stage. And we were supposed to wrap May 5th. And about middle of April, Eddie Murphy watched a series on TV about earthquakes and the fact that California was supposed to fall into the sea on April 31st of that year. I don't remember what 2000 it was, but that year. And so I got a call from his managers, and they said, Eddie saw this movie last night, and he will be leaving California on April 30th. And I'm like, but we're not finished shooting until May 5th. He's not going to stay. So
he wasn't leaving for the day. He was leaving
he was
forever?
Going home. He was going back to New Jersey where it was safe. So I called John and I'm like, we have a tiny problem. And he said, what have we got to do? And we sat down, the two of us, and I said, we are going to lose Eddie a week before we wrap. So what we went to, Ned Tannen was then the head of the studio production, and Sherry was there. And we went to them and we said, okay, look, we've got a problem, but we know how to solve it. Mm-hmm. So we had already figured out, he and I, what to do, which
First of all, don't let Eddie watch television.
That was, so many challenges. But anyway, so we figured out, we hadn't intended to build the set for the McDowell party until the very end of the, very late in our schedule, because it was expensive to hold all these sets on the stages and we wanted to strike and then build. So we figured out that if we built the set, we could shoot all of Eddie in the set one direction. And then we would use a body double that matched the back of him for all the big party scenes later. And so off Eddie went on April 30th, just like he said he was going to. So we shot him out and we finished the show without him.
And California did not fall into the ocean.
And California stayed in one piece. And nobody knows that. It's seamless. Like when you look at it, you won't know that that's not Eddie.
Now that is problem solving.
That is problem solving. And there were many of those all through my career. There's always the challenges of working in different locations with a different kind of crew. We've made movies that are all night shoots. We've made movies that are in various parts of the world, and each of them had their own challenges. But I think the things that were the most fun for me were on Trading Places, sitting with Ralph Bellamy and Don Amici and hearing the stories of the old Hollywood years.
Yeah.
Amazing. And that's a really great story because Trading Places, and this was pre my real exposure to the underpinnings of making the series, because I was working as George's assistant. But what happened was that they had initially intended to have Ray Milland and Ralph Bellamy be the brothers. And they couldn't insure Ray Milland.
Why?
He was too ill, and in those days, there were certain things that he couldn't pass an insurance exam with. And so at the very last minute, John and George had to figure out, okay, who are we going to replace him with that would be a good balance for Ralph Bellamy? So they went through a series of various older actors. And at one point, I think George probably said, because George's father, George Folsey Sr., was an amazing DP who was under contract in the MGM years. And so George said, what about Don Amici? So we went to SAG, and Don Amici wasn't even on the roster anymore. No one knew where he was. And we found him in Orange County. He hadn't worked in a number of years, and he was living in Orange County in a condo. He came up, he read for the role, and he got it. And he was fantastic.
Was he thrilled?
First of all, he was thrilled, but he was such a vibrant man. He read like 14 newspapers every day. He was a delight to have dinner with. He was just so well informed about the day, but also his stories of the past were incredible. And, both he and Ralph Bellamy performed with some of the most iconic actresses and actors of the time. And listening to them at dinner was the biggest treat of my life. And, like having lunch with Howard Koch Sr. I had lunch with him one day in the Paramount lot, and it was just like, I must have looked like a idiot because I was just so enamored of the stories and what he had to say and in awe of that time, because filmmaking was such a different world in generations before me, and it's such a different world in generations now that it's really kind of, I'm thrilled that I can be part of all of that, because it's just my breadth of experience, but also my breadth of adventures has been incredible.
Well, Anna, I'm going to tell you, people are going to feel like that listening to you.
Oh, thank you. I hope. It makes me feel very old. I mean, the fact that I'm still working is kind of interesting to me. And the fact that my experience and skill set is still of value, given that there are so many other people today who have experience that's different than mine. But I think having grown up from a very young age in the industry and dealing with all kinds of people, you learn a certain personality where you can cross over backwards and forwards. And a lot of filmmakers today, because of the compartmentalization of what's been happening in the industry, where you're a line producer, or you're a UPM, or you're an AD, or you're not necessarily all of those things, which is what I got to kind of be exposed to and participate in and help others get past. And so for me, I think that is a skill set that's still very valuable. And I encourage others to not get too compartmentalized in the way they approach their careers and their jobs, even though it happens more today where it's hard to break out of it. But the more they can learn from others in different parts of the business, the better off they'll be. Yeah. Because it's not as simple. It's not just one thing. And it's changing, ever changing. So having the experience to be in the movie business and in the TV business and in the digital business and in the VR business and the AR business, all those things are super important today. And women particularly need to experience every part of that if they can, because it's much harder for them to get to the same place, even now. Even with other women in positions of control, because people are still making decisions at the top, and most of them are still men and white men. So it's complicated. And I think they're learning a kind of respect they didn't learn before or didn't have to. I remember when I made a movie called Innocent Blood, which was about vampires and the mafia. And it was super fun to make. It was all nights in Pittsburgh for 50 days. So we worked from 7 at night till 7 in the morning. I was a total vampire myself for about a year afterwards. But I was working with a producer named Lee Rich. And Lee was an old-time producer. And when he heard that John was bringing me on as his producer, he was super pissed. He did not want to have to work with me. He didn't understand why he had to deal with this young person, and particularly a young woman. And, who does John think he was to have me? And we fell in love with each other. We just had the best time.
You turned him around.
But it wasn't even that. He just saw that, I knew what I was doing. I could converse with him. I shared all information with him because to me, one of the best and most important tools I've learned is collaboration. You have to be able to share, and you have to not be afraid of the competition. You have to be confident enough in your career and in your job that whatever you're sharing, and if it does, work against you, then it will. I have had those experiences in my life, but it doesn't stop me from wanting to collaborate because you always want to hire people smarter than you, and you always want to learn from them. And as long as you're willing to do that and share your information, you'll be successful. That's really how it feels to me. And I see that in the women at Women's Production Group. The women that are successful are women that have worked their way up and have worked really hard, but they've also are very open to sharing.
Yeah.
And helping others.
Was there a point in your career where you thought, I've made it, I'm a success, I'm in?
I don't know that I feel that way even now. I mean, every so often I'll meet someone and they'll be like, oh my God, your career is so extensive. It's amazing. And I have to think about that for a minute because I don't ever feel like I've made it. I don't know really what that means.
Right. What would that look
in
like?
In language. I mean, have I been super fortunate and grateful for everything? Yes. Have I worked my ass off? Yes. Have I enjoyed the fruits of my labor? Absolutely. There's nothing better than sitting in a movie theater and seeing something you've made. And even though you'll look at something and go, oh my God, I remember that day, that was painful, you still enjoy the fact that it's in one piece and that you have seen it all completed. And I think the most interesting part for me, if I were to say I've made it, which I still don't know what that means because I'm still working hard and I'm still working every day in a job, is that I have seen other women get opportunities and have become super successful and love what they do. And for me, that is part of what I see as my having made it.
Yeah.
It's just, and it sounds a little treacle and kind of silly, but at the same time, having come from where I came from, it's so gratifying. That's really the word. And being part of a community where a lot of people don't know what I've done. Like I sit in those meetings and there are many people who haven't seen all those movies. So, there are those days I begrudgingly when my daughter goes to see something that's been made once before and I'm like, why did they remake that movie?
Yeah.
It was so good. And then I realized, but she never saw it.
Right.
So why not, So it's one of those things where I hope I can work for a lot longer if that's what I want to do. And even though there have been many times where my career hasn't been, I've looked long and hard before I've gotten a job, and certainly had a lull for a period of time in my several years back. But I feel as though people are very respectful of the experiences and want to learn from them now. And there was a period there where there were a lot of younger executives coming in and hiring their younger buddies and realizing way too late that, wait, nobody knows what they're doing.
Right.
And then they all got fired. And then people came in and they started from scratch and realized, wait, where are all those people that really did the work, and knew what they were doing? Right. And had experience. And I think we're seeing that in the women who are getting opportunities in very higher places than before. And we're seeing it in the opportunities that women are given by each other. And I just think it's so gratifying and fantastic. I'm excited to see what's going to happen next because I do think that there's a change afoot.
For sure.
And, the only thing that hasn't happened, mind you, it has happened, but I was thinking about this the other day because there's so many smart women in so many different parts of the industry is being able to build a company that's all women owned and operated. And I think that's probably a hard thing to do. And I think Ava DuVernay in some ways has done it. I think that Annapurna has done it in a bit. Reese. Yeah, and I think that is, for me, a really, a fantastic thing, because you haven't seen that before.
Right. Now, do you know if you were paid equitable to the men around you?
Hard to know because there were no other women. Mm-hmm. And the men that I think I probably was paid fairly, but not as much, because I didn't know how to find out in those days. I still think women are not paid the same. And I still think women struggle to get the same kind of salary as men. And I think that men are way more helpful to other men than they are to women. So none of those things have changed, but I doubt very much I was making what other men were making in my situation.
Now, do you negotiate now when you go in for a new job?
Yes. And I have an agent. So it makes it, so I negotiate with my agent. But I also negotiate for myself because there are things that agents don't think about that I do, based on my experience now that I didn't think of before.
Like what?
I think that there are things that we don't think are that important that really are, like a title. Mm-hmm. Like, I never really cared. Right. But now I realize it's super important.
Well, and for your next job.
Yes. But also for other women. Yeah. Like, me not caring is not helpful for them.
Right.
Like, I don't... who cares? I mean, I've been doing this for so long. It's like either people respect me and pay me what I'm due or they don't. But for other women, it's really important. And so for me, it's become an issue. And the other thing is getting the same opportunities as their male counterparts. That if it's the phone and it's the being reimbursed for all of the meals that you do, and it's traveling business class, and it's all the things that your counterparts are getting that you need to be treated equally and equitably with. And you have to ask others what they're getting. And it's kind of a cumbersome thing. Women are not used to asking each other what they make or what to ask for. And I'm really lucky because when I first got into in-house, I had no idea what I was supposed to be asking for because that's a completely different thing than being a producer where you basically have a 9-month window and you're done. And I called Jeanette Brill and I said, what do I do? And what should I be asking? And do you think this is fair? And she was super helpful and really honest. And I'm so happy she's my friend because she couldn't have been more helpful. She really was really candid with me, helped me think it through in a way that I wouldn't have had the experience to do because I had no idea.
It's such a gift when you can find those women who you can talk money with.
Yes.
Really openly, really honestly, nitty gritty. It is such a gift and makes such a difference.
I think women still don't do it. They're very uncomfortable with it and they shouldn't be. Mm-hmm. They shouldn't be. They really need to start talking about it because guys do it all the time. Yeah. And it's a big issue.
And separate it from our worth and recognize that it's our value.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I think all of us have been very shy about getting the opportunity. And once we do, protecting the opportunity and not necessarily dialoguing with one another in a way that's really important. And being really honest with each other. Like, I'm going to leave my job at Gaumont. I'm looking for someone to replace me. And I gave them a list of all the women I knew. That was my position that I knew were looking. And some have called me and asked, will I be happy here? What kind of a situation is? And I'm really candid with them about what I think. Yeah. And I appreciate that Carol Trussell, when I came in, did the same thing for me. So there were no surprises. And it was fantastic, And so I think that these are the sorts of things that are the next step in women's sense of centering and power and opportunity and business. Right. Because it is a business. And
it almost sounds like because we've always been so grateful to get the job and the opportunity. Right. This is kind of flipping that over. Do I want to work here?
That's right. And I think a lot of women that I know who have been working in the trenches for quite some time are asking those questions because it hasn't been easy and it's never easy. And, even now, like, I am fighting for maternity leave for the younger women in the office because they're respectful of the California labor laws, but they haven't gone the extra mile. And I'm like, when I leave here, this position needs to change because I know how hard it was for me as a single mom and there needs to be equity.
And it's not enough to be able to keep your job but not be paid for 3 or 4 months. It's devastating.
That's correct. And the other thing is that I've learned, and I want to learn more about, is how many women are the sole providers of their households.
So many.
Because I was always the sole provider. Yeah. So it never occurred to me as a gay woman that, there are women who are married that husbands don't, they've made a different choice, And it was fascinating to me to meet women, and there are many I've met in the industry now that have said to me, I'm the sole support of my family, and I really need to think about these things, and whatever I can do to help them, just because of that.
Because the assumption is still that they're not, or somehow it's optional.
That's
or you can have a baby and then think about coming back to work.
That's right.
Or there's someone at home taking care of all the things that you also have to go home and take care of after your job.
And, you know, in some cases that's true for some of the women that have stay-at-home husbands, but a lot of them are still doing twice the amount of work.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating. I mean, we haven't really broached that subject in a way that we should, just for moral support. It's very important that women know they're supported in the workplace.
I used to get very lippy about it because I would say to my male counterparts, because I'm a single mother, it costs me $200 a day to go to work during the summer when I have to have childcare for my kids. Like, that's just the baseline of inequity.
Yes.
And they would say to me, well, do you think that's not the company's fault? Should the company be paying more for that? Not necessarily, but there should be an awareness of that's what people are up against, and not the assumption that it all just happens.
I have a guy that works for me right now who has 2 small children, and he's married, and he and his wife both work, and the girls are adorable. I always want him to bring them to the office whenever he can. But there are days where it's quiet at 4:00 in the afternoon. I'll say, go home and be with your family. He kind of looks at me like, what? And I'm like, it's not that busy. Go home. Be with your children. Yeah. It's so hard when we're busy for you to be with your kids.
And it goes so fast.
Oh my God. Life in the fast lane. It's crazy. If you ask me where the last 20 years of my life went, I could not tell you. And my kid is grown now. So it's one of those interesting things that I think that we need to be vigilant about the things that are important to women that they don't think about for themselves. We need to educate them about this sort of thing and what questions to ask. And I'm not sure that I'm super skilled at it, but if we started talking, I'd be able to help them. And I'm happy to. And, you know, I've done a lot of mentoring over the years with filmmakers. I mentored at AFI for 5 years in their production department. I've done a lot of lecturing at places where people ask me to come in and talk. And I'm very happy to do those sorts of things because it's a woman who's had some success talking about what to expect. And I think that's really important. I think it's important for young people to see a woman up there talking about it. And I think it's very important for them to come to you for advice.
And let's stop pretending that you have to act like there's no family happening behind you.
Yeah. And also that you have good days and bad days too. Yeah. I mean, some days I'm not always happy. You know, I'm grumpy at the office too. But, you know, it's one of those things where you don't get the opportunity of, like, friends of mine who are writers, women writers who had families. They didn't want to stay in the writer's room until 2:00 in the morning hanging out with their guy friends.
Right.
Because they had families to go home to. And for some reason, these guys were fine because they had wives at home looking after the children. Right. That it didn't matter to them. You know, they were fine. And I remember many of them saying to me over time, it's like, I just want to get a job where the guys want to go home and see their kids too, you know? And there are many like that who did not want to work long hours and were very productive in the time that they had.
I think this is starting. I think the younger men are starting to demand it too.
I think so too. And I'm really happy to hear that because many of us had those experiences where, you know, we would be getting notes from the writer's room at 3:00 in the morning and I'd be like, why are they still working? You know, that's crazy.
Go home already.
Go home, but also, you know, be with your families and also get some sleep. This is such a hard business.
You're going to burn out.
Totally. Totally.
Okay, I've kept you a long time. It's already over an hour.
Oh, wow.
What did I not ask you that I should have asked you?
New job?
Yeah, what are you going on to?
I'm going to be the head of production for Imagine.
Oh, wonderful.
So that'll be fun. Yeah, and that's...
TV or film?
I'm not exactly sure yet what I'm going to be across. I'm hoping everything. Because I'm going to help them build out an infrastructure that they don't have quite yet.
Wonderful.
So we'll see how we touch, you know, how that goes. But I'm looking forward to it.
Wonderful. When do you start?
Probably the end of July.
Okay. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for doing this.
It was my pleasure. Love talking to you.
You've been listening to The Other 50%, a herstory of Hollywood. I'm Julie Harris Walker. I'd like to thank Leslie Belzberg for sharing her story. And special thanks to Jay Rowe, Danny Rosner, and Allison McQuaid for the music. Please find us on your favorite podcast provider and leave a review. And of course, on our website, theother50%.com, all spelled out, for added features, bios of our guests, and the merch. You can also follow us on all the social media platforms. And go subscribe at catchabreakpodcast.com. Thanks for listening. See you next time.